On the other hand, there's no earthly reason whatsoever why a creative, responsible, loving human being should have to put on this act about being grave. You see, what is it? Our men in this culture are possessed by looking like clergymen, and to go around wearing black and things like that, and it's terrible. Why not break out? Enjoy color, delight, and so on. Because people are afraid if they wear too many colors. Do you know what the real reason is? Somebody will shoot you. You can be seen. You don't disappear into the landscape. So, or the Lord will say, "Who do you think you are coming on like this? What's all this stuff about? Disappear. See, you annoy me. You're too colorful." But you don't. You won't be wiped out for that reason. There are plenty of other reasons nowadays, but not that one. So, it is important for us to recover from myths which constantly bug us, they constantly annoy inside, that you have to watch out. See? Of course, some corporations are arranged so that you do. You work across the street, IBM, they require you to look as ordinary as possible, because that would make them nervous if you didn't. Things that aren't ordinary can't be thought of in terms of punch cards. Everybody soon will go around wearing a notice on them: "Do not fold, spindle, or mutilate." So, then, what I want to summarize what I've been saying this morning, which is this: a peculiar culture, social culture, based on a fearful attitude to reality, makes each one of us feel that we don't belong. It's working on the idea of being scared as the basis of a culture. So that you could say, all our literature, our drama, our religion, our music is a complicated way of being scared. And we cannot really, not in our culture, there are cultures where they do, that we can't let go and stretch out our arms and breathe deeply and say, "Oh, for heaven's sake, I belong in it. The whole thing is me." Not me in the sense of Alan Watts, not quite like that, but all of you, that it's the whole thing goes together as one enormous organism that is living it up. That's what we call being alive, isn't it? And doing all these things around us. In this third session, let me start by briefly summarizing what has happened up to this point. We have been studying the ways in which our sense of existence, of personal identity, is influenced by social factors. And in the first session, I described the two great myths of the nature of man and the universe which have dominated Western society. The Judeo-Christian myth, first of all, of our existence as being the creation of a cosmic king who is the foundation of being, who is reality itself, but to whom we are related as a sovereign and judge, and who therefore keeps us in a chronic state of guilt. This particular myth became so highly uncomfortable that it had to be abandoned by most intelligent people. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, they substituted for it another myth, which is the myth of a purely mechanical universe, which is unintelligent, unfeeling, unseeing, the total opposite of the one they had before, and in which we can live without being judged, but nevertheless with a fundamental sense of futility. This latter myth has become extremely plausible today, and it is, as far as I can make out, the thing that most people really believe in. So you can always test what people believe in by what they do. I'm highly suspicious of most Christians, because I don't think they believe it at all. They'd be screaming in the streets if they did. They'd be terribly earnest. They'd have the most hair-raising television programs on the fate and destiny of man if they took this thing seriously, but they don't. You see, what's happening in most of the churches is that the theological schools are very advanced, very liberal, but they feel they can't give their congregations yet what they think. And their clergy are apt, therefore, to be extremely frustrated people, always wondering in the back of their minds whether they ought to, in good conscience, maintain their jobs. But the plausible myth today is not the Christian myth or the Jewish myth. The plausible myth is this mechanistic universe, which I call the Newtonian myth. And what I wanted to get across to you in the first session was that that rather plausible and so-called realistic view of how things are is just as much a myth as anything else. It's a way, it's a formulating an attitude to life which has nothing really connected with the way things are at all. Then we went on in the second session to explore the influence of social institutions on our sense of identity. And I tried to show how social institutions involve the most fundamental ideas that we have, and that our ideas of time and space, of the nature of ourselves, and of the nature of the good life, and of the necessity for survival, are social institutions of exactly the same kind as the lines of latitude and longitude. Those are abstractions. They do not exist concretely, but they're extraordinarily useful ideas. Because it's only through, as it were, spreading networks and grids over the world in our imagination, by means of which we can measure things, that you and I can arrange to meet at the corner of Wilshire Boulevard and whatever the street is here, Vermont Avenue. It's interesting, in Buddhism, you find that all temples are guarded by very fierce-looking authoritative beings. So they're not like modern authorities. They don't have the same kind of glumness. They are much more ecstatic in their fierceness. And these are called the Dharma Rajas. That means the kings of the rule. They are the guardians of the 10 directions of the universe. Buddhism and Hinduism have 10 directions, that is to say 8 points of the compass, plus, above, and below. And these very fierce creatures stand at all temple entrances. And they are essentially the cosmic traffic cops, because they have to be fierce, because somebody has to lay down the law that we do recognize north, south, east, and west in a very firm way. And up has to be clearly distinguished from down, you see? So these people have a very important function. But at the same time, the Dharma Rajas have a slight twinkle in the eye, for all their fierceness. They know, you see, that the 10 directions are conventional. They don't think that they are absolutely real. They are enlightened, all of them. They're all bodhisattvas in the aspect of a bodhisattva which is wrathful. I suppose I haven't looked closely enough, but if you look around these paintings, you will find here, for example, is a wrathful bodhisattva, the sort of person who would be a guardian of the directions. Up here, there's this bodhisattva, and this one. They're beneficent. They appear in white color, and they have serene faces. But this one appears in black color and has a wrathful face. This is not a devil or demon in the Western sense of the word at all. He's simply a manifestation of the fierce side of reality. Some people don't feel really alive unless they're sitting on a spike. That tells them they're there. I went to Mexico this summer to explore this, because in Mexico they enjoy bullfighting, and they enjoy a kind of Catholicism in which suffering is the big bit. We went to the shrine of Guadalupe and watched young girls walking about half a mile on their knees to get into the shrine and for the special blessing. And then you find in the stores where they sell bondieuserie, that is to say, religious goods, all kinds of horrendous paintings of Christ with a crown of thorns on. And we made some very special meditations in the Cathedral of Oaxaca, in the inner chapel where they keep the sacrament. And in there is a crucifix that's just about as bloody as it can get. And on either side, pictures of Jesus being flogged on one side and of the agony in the Garden of Gethsemane on the other. And I was trying to penetrate, what is this thing? Why do people go into this kind of spiritual masochism? And it seemed to me very much that there is that end of things which is a spite, and which is extreme agony, and which is terribly real. And that you know you're there when you're on that point. The other end, you see, is the womb, is the all-embracing softness and loveliness. That's there too. But if you go too far into that, you see, you don't know you're there. So, this was a digression, but it is in terms then of our various social institutions that we formulate directions, structures, maps, weights and measures in our Rorschach blot universe. Although, you see, let me re-emphasize this point that I made in both former lectures. This is not exactly our projection on the universe. Many of you probably read a book called The Pathetic Fallacy, which is a discussion of the way men have in past times attributed human feelings and emotions to nature. The wind is sorrowful, and the moon is serene, and the sun is joyous. And the whole theme of 19th century philosophy was that this is not true. The sun is not joyous. The wind does not sigh. It's you who sigh. But that's not quite true. Because a sighing human being is only possible in a universe where there is wind. A joyous human being is possible only in the place where there's a sun. All these things that are called the external world are part and parcel of your whole mental existence. And so we borrow from the sun. We say so-and-so has a sunny disposition. so-and-so is a lunatic, oddly influenced by the moon. All our language is full of references to our external environment, simply because our external environment is one with us. That's why, in ancient times, and some people today, feel that you can draw the picture of a human being's soul by drawing a diagram of the arrangement of the universe as it was at the time when he was born. See, that's the art of astrology. Now, I personally think that modern astrology is pretty phony, because it is an archaic way of thinking about these problems in rather the same way that Paracelsus's idea of medicine was primitive as compared with modern medicine. Nobody has ever seriously thought out an up-to-date astrology. That is because the whole idea of astrology has been out of fashion among the more vigorous intellects for several hundred years. But the idea of it is in principle correct, that your soul is not inside your body. Your body is inside your soul. And what your soul is of course fundamentally the total universe. Now, our astrological maps don't include the total universe. They include only phenomena in the solar system. And in the surrounding galaxies, some of the stars which appear to be overpassed by the sun in its annual course have been selected to be significant. But if you were a super astrologer, you should put in all the galaxies, or as many of them as you're aware of, and think about them. But you see, the idea of astrology, the truth that underlies it, is that the universe is your character. And the way it is disposed and focused at your birth moment, which is really rather arbitrary point to choose. When did you start? Did you start when you were at the moment of parturition, the moment of conception, or when you were an evil gleam in your father's eye? It's arbitrary. And one should say, of course, that every here and now that you have and are is a focal point of all that there is. The moment of birth is simply selected as being significant because when the officials ask you who you are, they always ask you where and when were you born. For some reason or other, this establishes your age, this establishes your nationality, or something like that. And so that's a social institution. It's been agreed on as a peculiarly significant moment. But all moments, fundamentally, are just as significant as the moment of birth. You have a birthday every day, if you understand it aright. So, there is a tacit conspiracy in society to ignore the fact that the body is inside the mind or the soul, and that you're therefore playing the game of being a creature separate from everything else, all alone, locked up inside a bag of skin, and worrying like all get out whether you're going to make it, and being frustrated by the ultimate knowledge that you're not. That we all, because we are time binders, we know we're going to die, and that we'll eventually collapse, and that we'll get colder and colder and colder, and it will be most unpleasant, and then we'll fade out. But because we've got our minds turned inside out, you see, we've got our identity, our center of gravity in the wrong spot, then this worries us a great deal. But with that worry, we do all kinds of magic. If people didn't worry about dying, there would be no medicine. the whole craft of the physician and the surgeon and all the skills and marvelous things that it involves is based on worry about death. There are children born occasionally who can't be boxed into the scheme. And very often the so-called Mongolian idiot, or a child who is schizophrenic for some reason from birth, can't be made to be afraid of death. And some of those children just are playing everything for all it's worth. They see a light on a reflecting surface like that, and they dig that light. They go, you know, and everybody says, now come to yourself, behave. They don't care. If they come to an end, that'll be great too. They'll be fascinated with that experience. It doesn't matter what it is. They have no discrimination. They'll eat anything, put anything up their noses. They have absolutely no sense of what you should do and what you shouldn't do. The trouble is, you see, that if they had an understanding of the game that the rest of us are playing, they could get on very well, knowing their different game, and put the two together. And that's what I'm talking to you about. The trouble with them is that they don't understand our game. But that's the trouble with them from our point of view. Do you see that all decisions as to who is crazy are a question of majority vote as to what is reality? And that sometimes it's touch and go. You see, look, reality is what it is according to the kind of senses you have. Since in this room almost everybody's eyes are of the same structure, we are here and we agree. Everybody's ears and auditory nervous systems are of the same pattern, so we can all converse. Now, if a fly comes into our presence, he has an eye of a very different structure from ours. A fly, apparently, because of the multiplicity of lenses, sees the surrounding world from a considerably different number of points of view. They're not very different, but they're just subtly different. And that gives the fly certain advantages. But he doesn't see the world as, you know, if I see you there, sitting there, he sees you ever so many times. But he manages to unify that in some way. Now, the awkward matter for decision is when a human being has a different kind of consciousness from the average. To make the decision, is he advanced and seeing new things that nobody has seen before, or is he retarded and hasn't yet developed what the rest of us have? This is a very difficult decision to make. Genius is to madness close allied. But you've always got to one thing that our culture is a little bit defective about as compared, say, with the culture of the Arabs or the Hindus. We are not sufficiently respectful of crazy people. So, well, more or less what has happened is this. In the development of games, there was a time when human beings were wild. And that's what we call, in modern anthropological jargon, they lived in hunting cultures. They didn't live in any fixed place, and they roved, and they hunted. They killed other creatures to live. Now, in a hunting culture, every male member of the culture knows all of the culture. They don't have a division of labor. Every man is a master of quite a number of skills, and naturally every woman knows all her side of the thing. But they're not fixed. The religion of a hunting culture is shamanism. Now, a shaman is a liberated man who gets his liberation by going into the forests alone. The Indian cultures of the United States, especially in the West, are to a very large extent cultures of this kind. And their religion is a form of shamanism, and shamanism is a universal religion, spreads over the whole world. Mircea Eliade has written a marvelous book on shamanism. But the essential thing of the shaman is that he becomes liberated from even this loose sort of a culture by going off by himself. And naturally, the highly socialized people have a terror of solitude, because in solitude the awesome facts are slowly going to appear. First of all, the triviality of your role game, and then deeper and deeper in you get, until at last, one night, all alone and cold under the stars, you find out who you are. That's what every shaman does. And then he comes back into the world in those kind of societies as a magic man. But when human societies become agrarian and become settled, they divide labor, and they put a stockade around themselves at the crossing of two roads. All cities are fundamentally that, where two roads cross, and the cross is encircled with a pale. Pale, palo, tree, trunks spiked on top. And you say of somebody who isn't really at all nice that he's beyond the pale. You see, so we settled that way. And then what we did was we divided the functions of labor into the four quarters encircled by the city. And we made four castes. The first was priests, lords spiritual. The second was officials, soldiers and rulers, lords temporal. The third was merchants, and or the commoners. So the House of Commons in England is really a merchants' debating society. And finally, in the, as it were, the lesser of the quarters, the laborers, the workers. These are the four castes of Hinduism: the priests, Brahmana; the officials, Kshatriya; the merchants, Vaishya; and the laborers, Shudra. And so the holy man of an enclosed society of this kind is a priest, and he gets his authority not from going off by himself, but from a hierarchy. Now then, that's the game that we are still playing. Only we've modified it enormously. We're not living any longer in walled cities, but we have different kinds of walls. We have the dew line, the radar belts, and all that kind of thing. It's still essentially the same game, but it's been spread out in the most extraordinary way. And we have become so absorbed in this game that we don't have quite the same sense that our primitive ancestors had of there being an outside to the game. Because you see, there are two kinds of people beyond the pale. There are the people we throw out, and there are the people who go out. The outlaw who's a criminal is fighting one sort of game. The outlaw who is a saint is beyond the pale in the sense that people can't understand him. His experience is ineffable. That means what can't be effed or spoken. From the Greek pheme. So notice then this curious companionship between the saint and the no-good. They've always been associated. And it's a very odd thing. Jesus, as we know, sought out as his friends the disreputable people in the community. The whores and people who are now called notorious evil livers. I say not now, but they were. In the prayer book of the Episcopal Church, there is a passage about notorious evil livers who should not be admitted to communion. But you see, the funny, odd, queer thing is that it is precisely the notorious evil livers that people like Jesus cultivated. Because they were interesting. Because there is something in people like that that is manurish, feisty, that somehow cultivates a new thing. As the book of Revelation says, because thou art neither hot nor cold, but lukewarm, I will spew thee out of my mouth. You cannot pretend that you don't have the dark side in you. Everybody has a shadow. And if you won't acknowledge your shadow, you'll push it onto someone else. For example, often we find that people who are sexually repressed, and as I say, sex being the taboo in our culture was the problem thing, are very cruel. But here is the game involved, but it's an unconscious game. If you make sex the chief taboo of the culture, you make it terribly important. I've said that Christianity is the religion about sex. I mean, we think there are sexual religions like Priapism, which is phallic worship, or Tantric Yoga, which uses sexual intercourse as a form of meditation. But compared with Christianity, these are things only mildly interested in sex. Christians are utterly obsessed with sex. And today, the function of the churches is primarily to be family and sexual regulation organizations. That's about the only thing they do. Seriously, and the test of it is what can you be kicked out for? You can embezzle funds, you can be a drunk, you could be anything. But the moment you make a sexual mistake, out you go. That's what's scandalous. So, what do you mean by being immoral? What has come to your mind when you say somebody's immoral? Does it mean that he cheats and forges checks? It sure doesn't. What do you mean by living in sin? Does that mean that you're conducting a butchery? No, it means sex. I remember when we were in school, we had every year a certain clergyman came to visit us. And he had beetling eyebrows and was a very fierce kind of personality. And he always talked on the subject of drink, gambling, and immorality. And he rolled it round his tongue just like that. So immorality, it meant sex. And but do you see the duplicity of this? By making sex the naughtiest thing imaginable, it's made it terribly interesting. So this poses to anybody who becomes aware of this poses to everybody who's gone through psychoanalysis or anything like that, the question that St. Paul raises in the Epistle to the Romans. St. Paul explains that were it not for the law, he would never have known what sin was. Except the law had said, thou shalt not covet, I had not known lust. And so he says, it is only, therefore, because we came to know of sin that there can be deliverance from sin. The fact that we discovered that we were really incapable of being virtuous is the one really important thing for being in the process of being saved. Now, in that case then, you will notice that human history has done a very strange thing. Until 100 years ago, the course of human life remained at a certain even level which it had maintained for thousands of years. Life in England or France in 1700 was not remarkably different from life in Rome BC 50, or in Alexandria at the same period, where they had evolved extremely high cultures. And so far as peasant life is concerned, outside the great cities, it had remained substantially the same for thousands and thousands of years. But suddenly, with the Industrial Revolution, the whole human race goes like this. The population suddenly starts expanding at an unprecedented pace, and power is blowing out of us in all directions. Something quite different has happened. And the speed of social change, in other words, the rhythms of everyday life, are completely changed. Now, bees and ants have kept their life rhythms going for probably millions of years, without any change at all. They are very successful societies, and they are what you might call non-historical societies. They have no history, because they have a completely settled life, and in the same way, when human beings have a completely settled agrarian life, they do not record their histories. There is nothing to record. It's the same day after day. Are we, as someone has suggested, I forget his name, he wrote a book called Post-Historical Man, are we about to enter a non-historical stage? Spengler thought that we were going to turn into what he calls a fellaheen culture, where we're an enormous milling mob of fundamentally people who are just getting by, and eventually we are taken over by various beneficent despotisms which run us like an anthill, and that this may go on for hundreds and hundreds of years. Or what is far more likely, are we going faster and faster and faster towards the point of blow-up, in which we turn into a star? Well, now, it is said in the Hindu cosmology myth that as the Kali Yuga progresses, it becomes easier and easier for anyone to be liberated. Right at the beginning of the manifestation, liberation was amazingly difficult. And the reason was that life was too good. It was so pleasurable and delightful that nobody wanted to leave it. Obviously not. Because if the fundamental game is one of hide and seek, and therefore the initial phase of the game is to get lost, then in that case nobody wants to wake up, because the Godhead doesn't want to wake up. Not yet. But then, as you see, you get bored with being merely happy, and you start getting adventurous. You get involved in more and more far-out situations in which you goose yourself, you thrill yourself with the idea of being out of control. Let go, let go. So therefore, you see, again, by studying our own energy patterns, we begin to understand what's going on in general. So in the same way, you might say that in the game of hide and seek, the hiding, the abandonment of control gets more and more far out. But it goes along simultaneously with an attempt to control things more and more. Now, you remember how I described the two-way nature of a tree pattern, from the roots to the twigs, but also from the twigs to the roots. Well then, it is said by very deep Hindu metaphysicians that the pralaya and the manvantara, the manifestation and the interval between manifestations, are really simultaneous. If you're truly enlightened, you see that time itself is an illusion. There is in fundamental reality no succession. There is only the appearance of succession, as when you observe a Rorschach blot under the influence of LSD. It looks as if the blot is flowing into position. It is moving. You can see the paint or the ink or whatever is on it going, but it's always standing still and it's moving at the same time. So that's the situation we have. Eternity and time together. It's always there, but it looks as if it were changing. But it keeps changing into the same thing, hence the French proverb, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more it changes, the more it's the same thing. It keeps turning into itself. So the counter movement is this, that at the end of the cycle, things get more and more out of control. And everybody, every individual, has the sense of powerlessness, that the government is out of hand, that nobody is put up for election whom we care to vote for, that the whole thing is a mess, and that you can't do anything about it, and the wars which we don't want get more and more imminent and dangerous. Yet at the same time, we are trying to control everything, and so government gets more and more uptight. And at the same time, since we are coming to the end of the cycle, in which the divinity wakes up from the dream, more and more people are beginning to have mystical experience. That is the waking up process. But then, in all this, there is the kind of terror, you see, of waking up. Because that is a way of experiencing one's own hush to oneself. That is to say, when you want to play hide and get lost and imagine that you are all this, and that is your firm intention, so much so that it produces the vivid reality of all this going on, you are repressing who you really are, what you really are. And that repression when uncovered, is experienced in the form of terror at finding out. Don't look into the secret box. See? There's always something. There's always a forbidden area. There's always something behind the scenes with a sign that says, keep out. You mustn't find out what goes on in there. And so, naturally, the suspicion in which the mystics have always been held is that they disobeyed the keep out sign. They looked under the carpet. They peeked through the bathroom keyhole. They found out what was going on behind the scenes. The mystic is a peeping Tom. Yes, obviously from the point of view of the management, because the management keeps the show going. The show must go on. You must be responsible. The mail must be delivered. People must be fed. Babies must be looked after. Of course. The show must go on. And therefore any suggestion that this is completely unnecessary will be regarded as utterly subversive. And of course it is subversive. Because it turns the carpet upside down, that's all. So then you get this really frightening picture that as we move ineluctably towards the final colossal explosion, we all begin waking up and we begin to see in our visionary experience the great white light. Well, what do you suppose that is? Why, that's the star you're going to turn into. The light of glory. God in the form of the sun. Greatest and most ancient symbol, even used by Christians, when God is called the Sun, S-U-N, of justice, and is born and in the form of Christ at the winter solstice, which is the period of the birth of the sun, because it is when the sun is at the lowest point in the midheaven and is starting to rise again towards the summer solstice. Now just let's suppose, I've been telling you a fairy tale, a science fiction sort of thing. Let's say we're getting into a new thing called metaphysical fiction. And let us see if that is the possibility, and what is actually happening, what will be our attitude towards it practically? We can react in horror and say, oh no, not that. Of course, it happens in nature all the time. Tribes of insects or animals of various kinds, lemmings, methodically annihilate themselves. They commit group suicide. So we can object to it very strongly. But the curious thing is that the harder we object to it, the faster it happens. All warmongers are pacifists. And therefore they call their war department the Department of Defense. They're always fighting for peace. And for justice or some good cause. So it is highly possible then that if we accept that this is the state of affairs, And we do not do anything to try to prevent ourselves from blowing ourselves up, that this could very possibly have a slowing down effect on the whole process. What happens, you see, is that the system does blow itself up through expansion of its control over itself. So therefore, the more you have the powerful fascistic type government, whether it masquerade under the name of communism or capitalism or whatever, it's all the same thing. The government is invariably the most successful group of gangsters. So when it gets very, very tough and strong, you can see then that the world is getting uptight. And as any system whatsoever gets uptight, it begins to vibrate too fast. It's the same principle as the thermostat. If you get the thermostat uptight, that simply means that you have put your on switch point and your off switch point too close to each other. When you wanted to control the temperature of the room and keep it exactly at 70 degrees, so that you put the off switch at 71, the off switch at 69 and the on switch at 71. No, sorry, the other way around. It goes off at 71 and on at 69. Then you see what happens is it's too close. The mechanism confuses the go with the stop signals. And so it starts going on and off, on and off, on and off, and it shakes itself to pieces. That is a mechanical analogy of anxiety. And to be uptight, you see, is to be anxious. And so the colossal paranoia and anxiety that spreads through the world today on all sides, engendering vast secret services, espionage systems, espionages on espionages, and police looking after policemen, and all that kind of thing, is what is going to blow it all up. Because it's all being done in the name of security. You know, the security officer. There is no security. There never was. And everything that is done to ensure it is a source of trouble. Like insurance. Read Ambrose Bierce, The Devil's Dictionary, the section on insurance. So then, the only thing that might be done is really to do nothing. To start relaxing. Saying, well, if rape is inevitable, enjoy it. By doing this, we would considerably slow down our own demise. In other words, one says to the people who want power, you want power? Take it. You bore yourself. You tie yourself up in knots trying to arrange everything. And I think that under such circumstances we would find there would be a considerable solution of problems. You know, it's like the riots. If the police weren't there, they wouldn't have happened. It was by anxiety to keep everything under control that you started a riot. Now, I'm not saying that I know the details of how to work this out, but I am saying that if that is the direction in which things go, you cannot oppose it. There's no point in opposing it. You could, by understanding that you have to go with it, you could tack against it and slow it up. But we do know that life is always a process which tends towards death. It tends to run down. Things fall apart. They wear out. Even though the biological organism is different from the geological. The geological simply disintegrates slowly. The biological tends to work against entropy. But it still always comes apart in the end. And therefore, we have to see that maybe one lives by accepting death just as one flies by an understanding of gravity. Using judo, there may be a way of using judo against gravity to throw ourselves up into the air. How do you suppose a salmon jumps upstream? It isn't just a matter of muscle. It's quite certainly, I think, a question also of the angle of the tail to the falling water. It's like a dolphin can set its tail at a certain angle to the wave made by the bow of a ship and can skitter along the water riding on that wave. It's a big surf job. So then, if for any reason whatsoever or in any design whatsoever life is a system that is always deteriorating, sure, it may be going up like this, you see, but it always drops. And after it's gone like this and this and this and this for a certain cycle, it's going to go like this and this and this and this and this and this and this, probably getting a bell curve or something in the end. So, the moral of all this is really that the current fear, paranoia, mistrust of everyone and everything is itself the process of destruction. If you can get it into your heads that, well, it just doesn't matter. Survival is not the important thing, because you're not going to survive. This will do two things. One, it will eliminate an enormous amount of hostility and, as it were, trigger happy fingerness. Two, it will liberate an enormous amount of our energy from defensive, security, military projects to things that are more economically useful, like the provision of food. You cannot, you see, be even a good soldier until you have reached a certain stage of development where it makes no difference whether you live or die. This was always part of the training of the samurai, that before he could really learn the use of the sword under a skillful master, he had to get to the point where he wasn't constantly anxious to defend himself, because that put his body into a certain kind of tension which rendered him incompetent. He had totally to overcome the fear of death. That was the first requisite. And you can overcome the fear of death only by realizing that it's completely inevitable, that everybody here is as good as dead, under sentence of death. Only because you don't know when it's going to happen, it isn't such a grim affair as somebody in death row, although it's just as certain. And just as they hire lawyers to put it off, you carry on business and generally delay your demise. The thing that makes the death row peculiarly awful is that it's all so deliberate, and nothing is more torturing to a human being than to be a complete social outcast, who are despised by everybody else. He has a real reason to feel paranoid. But otherwise, we are all just as much under sentence of death. And there simply is no point in straining to prevent this happening. That doesn't mean that you cease to take care in driving a car or to be sure that you don't eat poison and so forth. But it means get off the strain, the general uptightness about preventing one's own demise, and you'll live long. It doesn't seem logical, but I think I've demonstrated that it is. For you see, it is through the acceptance of death that you become suddenly charged with life. But I say, if you give up the impossible task, you have all the energy that you've been using to strain against the inevitable to do something great, so that you become alive in the degree that you accept death. This is true of the individual, and it can be equally true of society. That as society realizes that, we cannot hold the form of our nation, the form of our civilization, the form